Good morning, friends, and welcome to another time of Wandering Toward Wonder. My name is Will Ed Green. I'm an associate pastor and the director of discipleship at Foundry United Methodist Church here in Washington, D.C. And this is Wandering Toward Wonder, a time we get to set aside each week to cultivate joy and wonder and awe in our lives. Um, I am tuning in today from my home in the Brightwood Park neighborhood of DC. And as you join me today, and I know that there will be folks joining here in the next little bit, as you join in, I would love to know where you're watching from this morning. And that's just a way for me to be able to celebrate that you've been with me, to give thanks for the ways that we're creating some sacred space, some community together. And so please sound off in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. And as always, as you're watching today, I want to encourage you if you see a name pop up of somebody you've not seen in a while, of somebody that maybe you know, I want to encourage you to leave them a reply, leave them a comment, let them know that they've been seen in this virtual world, in this kind of passing the peace virtually thing that we've been doing as of late. Um, and you know what a gift it is to be back with you after 2 weeks of extended Sabbath. I've missed this time. I've missed this space, and I'm glad to be back in the saddle, so to speak. Especially as we prepare ourselves for the Christmas holiday. This is one of my favorite times of the Christian year, and even though this is a little bit different than what we're used to, I'm excited for the ways that we're building community together at Foundry. Um, I have had a lot of time while I've been away to do some wandering of my own, whether in Rock Creek Park or the Shenandoah National Forest or back and forth between my refrigerator and the couch. And I really am excited to be able to share with you and sit with you and think about some of the ways that I've found wonder in these last days. The thing that's really on my mind today has to do with how hard taking 2 weeks of Sabbath, even if it was a slightly modified Sabbath, really was, how hard it is to rest. Um, those of you who know me well, my colleagues will admit to this, to know that it's very, very hard for me not to keep just showing up, to keep doing, to um, keep on working, to draw boundaries between work time and rest time. And I've really just been struck again this week as I've taken some of that time for rest, how really countercultural rest is, how um, slowing down is kind of perceived as social sin, and the ways in which waiting in particular, and so interestingly in this Advent season, which is all about waiting, but how waiting, the space between doing one thing and doing something else is just downright challenging, right? I don't know about y'all, and I'd love to know in the comments if waiting is hard for you too. Goodness knows it is for me. I think some of that has to do because, as we've discussed many times before, and will continue to, I'm sure, the way that social valuation, our worth in the world is established, is oftentimes based on what we produce or what we input into the world around us, and so we have this tendency to confuse our work and our worth, or the ways that we're caring for somebody else and our own worth, or the ways that we're showing up in protest and our own worth. And the insidiousness of that, this kind of confusion between worth and what we do, is that it impacts not just our professional lives, right? I'm not just talking about never turning off your email or never turning off the notifications. I'm talking about the ways that this tendency to want to assume that our value is found in what we do shapes how we spend our time with people we love. I mean, I think it can inform the ways we choose to or not to create time for friends, or to be available when the phone rings, and we know that it's going to be a long conversation. I've got those family members that will get on the phone, and man, what should be a 10-minute conversation is a 40-minute conversation. Um, and there's a part of the valuation of whether or not I'm going to pick up the phone that goes into that, where I'm thinking, how much am I actually going to be able to do? I mean, this tendency to want to value our worth based on what we input even shapes the hobbies we have. Is this hobby, is this thing that I do for fun, quote unquote, going to be worthwhile? You look at the ways that so many times, and I'm mindful of my time in youth ministry, kids are kind of forced into sports because there's some like thinking they're going to get a scholarship, or people will pick up another language because they think it's going to be good for them professionally. And we treat that like it's fun. We treat it like it's a hobby, um, but it's still kind of work, right? Um, so this insidious way that not being able to wait or rest or Sabbath shapes everything about how we are has been on my mind a lot lately, and waiting especially. If we understand waiting to be that space kind of between doing a thing and then doing another thing, especially if we don't know what's going to come next in the in between, is the opposite of this culture of doing and instantaneous communication and conversation. I mean, you look at the way that people double check email timestamps, and if they don't get that email in 10 minutes, then man, something is wrong. The world is on fire. And trust me, I show up this way too, in ways in which everything kind of feels like a five-alarm fire all the time. Even text message read receipts, if that's something that y'all do in your friend networks, like those things, this way in which we can't wait, becomes an excuse to really fuel our anxiety about our place in a relationship or a professional space. It becomes a way to fuel frustration or to justify our anger. It becomes a way to justify our self-doubt. Oh my God, they've not responded yet. Do they not like me? Do they not love me? Am I not doing this right? Is something wrong? So this way in which being unable to rest, slow down, or wait informs so much dis-ease and unhealth has just really struck me again during these 2 weeks off. And I've really begun to kind of think about waiting in this way that waiting is kind of a form of resistance, right? Um, and what we're resisting is this like this cultural lie that we always have to be available because either we're going to miss out on something. If you've heard of FOMO or ever experienced FOMO, fear of missing out, you'll know what I'm talking about. We're told that we always have to be available because we don't want to fail those we love and care for. And somehow, if we're not doing it all and always there and always on top of it, then that's a sign of our commitment or connection to somebody. Um, and I think we're called to resist that, right? To ground our love, to ground our relationships, to ground our sense of being in something deeper than responsiveness and reactivity to every single thing that's going on around us. Because let's be honest, if we were responding and reacting to every single thing that happened every single day, all the time, we'd all be about as thin as a sheet of paper, right? We'd be stretched in all these different directions, and nobody would get anything because we were trying to be everything for everybody. Um, there's a way in which, I think waiting resists this notion that if we're not doing, we're doing something wrong, right? Um, Sound off in the comments if you know what I'm talking about, but I know plenty of people, and I am one of them, that I begin to kind of feel guilty if I'm not doing something. Like the act of just sitting and doing nothing feels like sin, right? The act of just disengaging and turning everything off feels like failure. Um, and I think waiting is a way to resist this thing that keeps us from getting the rest and the space, both to practice self-awareness, right, so that we can spend some time just sitting with ourselves, and also just to like take care of our bodies and to stop working for a little bit. It's a way of resisting this narrative that emphasizes so being in control of everything around us all the time, right? Like there's this tendency we have as a culture um, to believe that we're always capable of being in control of holding it all together, or that we should put our trust in somebody who can make us feel like they can. And waiting really undermines that message, right? Like creating some space to not know what comes next, to not be doing, to not be trying in that way, means that we've got to find that sense of comfort and security in something other than ourselves or somebody else. And I would argue that as Christians in particular, our work of resistance through waiting is to ground that in the abiding presence of God, who promises us that, and you've heard all of our pastors say this at some point or another, even when we can't see a way, God goes before us to make one. I think about what it would have been like for Mary on the road to Bethlehem, knowing that this baby was coming and knowing what the angel had told her and not knowing what was coming yet. Um, and I think kind of living in that space and trusting as Mary did. And I think one of the most powerful witnesses of what faith can do. It's just it's important. It's an important form of resistance, and waiting too is a resistance of all a resistance to all those voices and things and demands which constantly crowd our mind. It's an act of faith that, like we've just said, places emphasis not on our own strength or power or ability to be in control, or in that of others, right? Of our presidents, or our representatives, or our pastors, or our doctors, but placing those things in God, placing that trust in God, and just creating some space to be still. I've been teaching Disciple 1 these last months, and I continue to think about the narrative of Aaron and the golden calf, right? And the way in which the people were so afraid to wait that they had to create something to help them feel secure in their waiting, rather than just waiting on God. And how we have a tendency to want to create of ourselves, or create of others, or create of institutions, these golden calves, these idols, which help us find security in something which is inherently insecure, whether that be a religious institution or a political institution or a person. And how waiting and how practicing waiting helps us resist that temptation to create these false idols. Now, I want to acknowledge that as I've been thinking about this, the kind of dueling narrative in my mind has been that there's some real theological danger in this idea of waiting as a form of Christian resistance, because of course waiting can be a form of oppression too. I've been reading this great book called Embracing Hopelessness by a guy named Dr. Miguel de la Torre. And what he's exploring in his book is the way that the promise of kind of an empty Christian hope, and I know Pastor Ginger's been doing some really beautiful reflection on this recently, that is a hope that tries to justify Christian violence or injustice, disinterest in speaking out against the social evils of racism and sexism, with the idea that in the end it's all going to be okay, is really just a tool of the privileged, often white, middle class, cisgendermen like me. It's a tool of oppression. It's a way of preaching this placating gospel that just encourages people to soldier through and to ignore their pain and ignore their suffering and to ignore the injustice in the world, rather than speak up and out. Rather than to name hopelessness, he says, and then because of that to fight for a world which is more just, into which hope can be born. And I think that's true about waiting as well, right? That oftentimes the Christian admonition to wait on God has been used to justify people's suffering, to encourage people to inaction, and to suggest, especially to people who endure the brunt of the church's disinterest in their suffering and the world's implicit and explicit violence against them, that they should just wait for God to fix it. Just wait. Have hope. Trust. Wait. So let me just pause for a second now and say a thing about this message that God's just going to fix it. God is not Bob the Builder. Let me say it again. God is not Bob the Builder. If you're familiar with that cartoon, God doesn't just fix it, right? That's not how this works. That's not how this relationship between us and God works. We're called to lend our hands and hearts and work and protest to the work of creating justice, right? And so any gospel message which encourages you or someone else to wait for a world in which they're safe, loved, and celebrated is not the gospel at all. To those, in the words of a sermon, to those gospels, in the words of a sermon I preached a few months ago, not today, Satan, not today. That is not the kind of waiting I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is creating some space to stop doing so that we can remember how to be in the presence of God, to be ourselves in a world that wants us to be created in its image, right? I'm not talking about waiting for injustice to just go away, because that's not how it works. So why does this work of waiting matter? is the other kind of question I've been asking, right? And so I've kind of landed on a couple of things I wanted to share. I want to welcome your feedback. This is a thing that's kind of new and emerging in my mind. Um, but I think waiting is a way, as we resist the temptation to do and to go and to accomplish and whatever. Waiting is a way of really reclaiming our sense of self, right? It's a way of refusing to allow others to define or dictate our worth because we refuse to always be available. And maybe it's not responding to that text message right away, even if they've seen the read receipt, or knowing that that email has an important question in it, but man, you know what, you need to turn your computer off and go play with your cat or your dog or your kids, or sit down in front of that TV and watch Mary Berry and the Great British Baking Show, so that you can soothe your soul, whatever it might be, right? I think refusing to allow others to define or dictate our worth because we refuse to always be available is a way of remembering our worth, which is grounded in God's love for us, right? And it's also a way of remembering that our grounded being, who we are created to be, how we are created to be, and the source of our identity and worth, it's not in how many emails you send in a day. I have to keep telling myself that a lot. A lot. I'm sorry for all of my Foundry colleagues who are watching. It's not in how many friends you're able to placate or make happy or offer counseling to. The ground of your being, of your worth and your identity is in God's love. And sometimes that's going to mean not showing up and not always doing, but being in God's presence, silently, waiting, being patient, not doing, caring for yourself. Waiting is a way of remembering that we're not, and this may be a hard message. I kind of reflected on it a couple of weeks ago, and it's still there in the back of my mind. But waiting is a way of remembering that we are not as important or necessary as we think we may be, and man, that is good news. I don't know about how many of you carry around this guilt of feeling like you've got to do all of the things all the time. I was raised in a family where, by the time I was a freshman in high school, there were 8 of us living in a little itty bitty house. And I was waking up early in the morning, and I was helping my mom get the kids ready for school, and I was driving everybody to school, and I was picking people up from school, and I was doing church stuff, and I was doing stuff for my other family members, and just on and on and on and on. And I developed early on in my life this profound sense of over responsibility, and I've had to learn and remember again and again that I'm not as important or necessary as I think that I am. That if I don't do a thing, there are other people who can do what I do, and then that's okay, because sometimes I just can't do. And the real gift in that I think that God gives us is that as we remember that truth, that as we learn to be a little more humble in our approach to ourselves, and we're able to be more gentle and loving and honest when we fail, when we falter, when we screw up, and we're able to be a little more honest and realistic with the boundaries that we draw, which in turn, of course, helps us show up more meaningfully in our relationships with other people, helps us reserve our energy for the things that really do matter, helps us create some space to be able to discern what matters and what doesn't. Because suddenly, if not everything matters, we've got to get real clear about what does. Waiting helps us do that. This work of resistant waiting helps us do that. And waiting is an act of faith toward God. And that's the thing that has been most on my mind lately. It is very easy, even as a pastor, to put your faith in all kinds of other things, whether it's denominational authority, or it's the system that you've created to do the thing, or it's whatever it might be. It's easy for us to put our faith in things that seem active, in things that seem like they're making a difference in the moment, right? But as we learn to wait and be still in the presence of God, to let go of the things that demand our time, our attention, our action, that whisper into our ear that our worth is found in what we do or accomplish, we begin to, with a lot greater clarity, understand how God is speaking to us, where God is leading or inviting us deeper into relationship with God, where we're being called to actually show up and do. And there are stories in the Bible again and again about this, whether it's Ezekiel hearing the still small voice of God in Ezekiel 37, or it's Mary after angel choirs and shepherds and all these people show up after she's just given birth. Can you imagine? And she knows what's coming. She's heard what the angel has said. And yet, the story ends with it saying Mary treasured all these things in her heart. It didn't say Mary went out and started a new religious order. It didn't say that Mary went out and started preaching on Jesus' behalf. It said that Mary pondered all those things in her heart. And there's something about creating that space for pondering that helps us show up better when we need to show up. So what? What do we do with all this waiting stuff? So some of you know, I think some of you are in the Marking Holy Time class that I've been journeying with these last couple of weeks too. And we've been practicing a prayer practice called centering prayer. If you've been a part of the class and that's been a practice that you've learned something through or about, I'd encourage you to leave that in the comments. I'm kind of watching those off to the side here. But centering prayer really is this invitation to just sit in the presence of God, to practice waiting, right? And to trust that our waiting is not disengagement from God or distance from God or emptying ourselves of all these things, but it's rather actively creating space for God to be present to us, right? Kind of push aside the things that we're doing, that are saying we need to be doing, that are speaking into our lives, so that God can speak. And so I've given Jackie, who's part of our comms team here helping support my live today, a link with a little more information about centering prayer, and we're going to drop that in the comments now. I want to encourage you, especially in this Advent season, which is really all about waiting, right, for the birth of Jesus, to take this as a really good time to maybe practice some of this resistant waiting. And to try to begin to create some space where maybe you can reclaim and remember what it means to be in the presence of God, to be beloved of God, to be rested, a little more sane, whatever it might be for you, instead of do. And if you want some more in-depth instructions on centering prayer, I'm happy to provide those to you. You can email me at wgreen@foundryumc.org, and I am happy to be in some conversation with you about it. But I want to encourage you, this week and maybe the next week to try this practice and to let me know what you think. So next time we're together, I'm going to ask if you've been joining in with me today. I hope you'll join me next week at 10 o'clock. And let's just continue to think about this gift of waiting. Before we head out today, I know I've been with you for about 20 minutes already. Wow. And just a couple of quick reminders. Every Wednesday right now, this Marking Holy Time class is getting together to practice various prayer disciplines, and you don't have to be in the class to join us. So we're going to drop a link to the registration event where you can get the Zoom information. If you're looking for some help in creating some of this time for prayerful waiting, this is a great way to do it. We gather from 6 to 6:30 on Wednesdays. We've got a couple of really beautiful Christmas season services coming up. So our longest night service on the longest night of the year, December 21st, will be at 7 o'clock. Pastor Kelly's helped us put together a really beautiful service. And I hope you'll join us. That's a gift for people, especially who might be feeling the weight of grief and sorrow and just like bleh in the holiday. So if you're feeling that, if you know somebody who's feeling that, I hope you'll join us. And then, of course, on Christmas Eve at 7 o'clock, we'll gather for worship and to receive again the story of Jesus' birth. So I hope you'll join us in that. And then we do something called the Advent Appeal every year. Many of you are familiar with it. This year, we're receiving funds to help support our community organizations that are helping support neighbors that are facing the looming eviction crisis, among other things, and to support Foundry's ministry in that through our Greatest Need Fund. And so you can visit the link that we're going to drop into the comments to help support that work. And then I certainly hope you'll join Pastor Ginger tomorrow at noon for Ponderings from the Purple Parlor, where she'll continue sharing her wisdom and her thoughts with us. Friends, again, it's so good to be back with you. I hope you are well. I hope that you've heard a thing that sparked a thing in you today. Um, Remember to continue being gentle with yourselves. Remember that God loves you, and I do too. And until next time, keep wandering on towards wonder. Bye for now.